Minister, obviously there are a huge number of aspects to this legislation, but I do mainly want to concentrate on the changes to the Pension Act rather than the actual social welfare provisions, which I think have been addressed by other deputies. But I would say that I'd like to strongly agree with the points made by Deputy Pringle in relation to our obsession with alleged social welfare fraud, which has been demonstrably shown to be the case of, in most cases, to be incidents of error where it does occur. And the idea which we received as part of the briefing notes on this bill, that the Minister proposes to second 20 Gardaí into a virtual sort of hit squad to pursue social welfare fraudsters, as it were, is to me absolutely unbelievable, when we have the biggest problems in our society pertaining with, in actual fact, white-collar crime. And what I think it does is just send a signal to try and scapegoat some of the most vulnerable sections of our society by blowing these allegations of fraud into being something that they actually aren't, and that statistically the instances of fraud are quite minor. But in any case, we can deal with that later on. Just in terms of the amendments to the Pension Act, which I want to concentrate on, this is a hugely important issue. I think pensions and an expectation in retirement to live out your life comfortably and attain a certain standard of living is something that I think we should all aspire to. It is something which has been undermined by pension insecurity in many of the schemes, and this does propose to bring in amendments dealing with the defined benefit pension schemes. Now, I think we have to sound a word of warning by this, because the problems in those schemes are not caused by what we've been told before, people living longer, as if that was somehow a bad thing. That's a very good thing. The reasons why these schemes were underfunded, in my opinion, has been as a consequence of the casualisation of labour, the undermining of the idea of a secure, permanent, pensionable job, and instead those jobs being replaced by outsourced contracts and so on, with the result that the lifeblood of pension schemes were being eroded, as well as a number of management decisions which also undermined that system. So, while recognising that there have been problems with defined benefit schemes, I'm really worried about the volume of piecemeal changes to our Pensions Act which are impacting on pensioners. And I don't think we're taking a holistic or a proper view on it. We had the scenario less than 6 months ago, in the run-up to Christmas, where radical changes were implemented to defined benefit pension holders, rushed through the last week of the Dáil, with the consequence that existing pensioners of defined benefit schemes ended up experiencing a massive reduction in their standard of living in some of those schemes. To take my own scheme, a very major defined benefit scheme, the IASS Airline Superannuation Scheme, which would have 15,000 members in it, roughly divided between active, deferred and existing pensioners. The pensioners in that group, as a result of the changes put forward, took a hit of €7 million. €7 million taken out of the pockets of thousands of pensioners, which obviously has an immediate impact on the surrounding areas in terms of purchasing powers and so on. And that legislation failed to take into account employer responsibility, and I don't think we're doing enough of it here. And we have the irony now that people who formerly worked for Aer Lingus and what was formerly Aer Rianta in the UK will have all of their pension benefits secured, but their Irish counterparts who worked in the same company won't, and are experiencing major losses in that regard. Now, I obviously don't have time to go into all of the details, but the Minister is aware that many of the groups in schemes such as that have had to organise and seek recourse to legislation and potentially to the courts to exercise their rights. And I think we shouldn't be tinkering with pensions legislation while there are huge changes going on behind the scenes, because it's not desirable to do it in that way. The Minister is probably aware of a very important case that was heard in the UK last month, which defined the idea of a reasonable expectation in law, and it was a case in relation to a defined benefit scheme involving IBM, which it's been deemed to have significant potential impact on Irish pension schemes, where basically the High Court report in the UK said that the changes proposed by IBM to its pension schemes confounded the reasonable expectations of the scheme's members, which were for benefit accrual to continue into the future. And basically the judge in that case said that the key aspect of the decision was the development of the concept of reasonable expectations of employers and scheme members, and that would potentially affect an employer's duty of care. Now, this case law potentially can have an impact on the scenario here in Ireland, and I think it's interesting that we're discussing this legislation after the Queen's speech last night in Britain, which announced major changes to their pension scheme. If you like, a new idea to deal with defined benefit schemes for the modern era, where they're putting forward the idea of what's called Dutch-style collective pension funds, where they say that rather than workers saving into individual pots, which are more vulnerable to variations on the stock exchange, that workers would pool their investments into a mega fund, which would then pay them an income in retirement. Now, it's been alleged that these changes could, by minimising the risk, see pensioners secure a post-retirement income of greater than 30% of what's been achieved at the moment. Obviously, critics would say there are warnings in that, and the Dutch are looking at ways of moving away from that scenario. I'm not saying that it is a panacea, but it is interesting that different ways of dealing with the pensions crisis in a more holistic way are being put forward in other jurisdictions. And I think it is a little bit ironic that we're discussing legislation here in relation to unilaterally restructuring defined benefit schemes at the direction of the Pension Authority, and yet the Pensions Authority have sounded warnings about over-reliance and investment in equities. So why aren't we looking at something, for example, like the British model? Why aren't we looking at schemes like the IASS scheme being maybe potentially taken over by the NTMA, as some public service pensions are, and why aren't we exploring the concept of pooling risk rather than some of the changes being put forward? Because there are alarm bells ringing with people about some of these changes, such as why is there legislation being put forward now to protect the Pensions Authority in unilaterally decisions to wind it up? Why is the onus being put on trustees in the schemes? Does this not let the Pension Authority off the scheme? How are the trustees going to inform all the members? For example, you have 15,000 members in the IASS scheme. While pushing through this legislation, the government haven't yet brought in the suggested changes that we made during the discussions on the last bill about giving the deferred groups and the existing pensioner groups a right to sit at the table and to be consulted in these changes. And while we talk about pensioners having the right to go to the High Court in these cases as if that's somehow a bonus, I don't think that's a bonus. Most pensioners are on average 72 years of age. Their average pension is about €16,000. It's not that easy if you're on an income and an age like that to access the High Court and get justice in that regard, and the experience hasn't been that favourable for that. Why aren't we looking at different ways? For example, the industrial relations machinery of the state being allowed to be accessed by people who've left their employment. We've raised these before. The Minister, during the discussion on the last bill, said she would deal with some of these issues in the guidance notes, but they weren't dealt with. And here we have another legislative change, which is also impeding on the Shannon State Airport bill, which has other changes coming in. And I just think there's too many bits going on the sidelines which are going to undermine the integrity of these schemes, and we're not looking at it properly. And I think we will pay a heavy price for that in that regard. I don't see why we aren't, seen as we're moving legislation, allowing existing pensioners and deferred groups to have a seat at the table, which they should have anyway. I think there are a lot of other issues that could be addressed. We don't really have the time here, but you know, people are saying, why aren't you looking at the bigger picture? Why is there not just pension legislation dealing with these issues? And why is there not greater protection being there? Because again, one of the key faults in this is that we're allowing for a situation where benefits which pensioners have paid into pension pots can be eroded. they can be reduced, and this just allegedly gives them access to a remedy, but to me it doesn't. It puts up another barrier there, and I think when you look behind the scenes at all of the tens of thousands of workers who've already retired from these companies or who are currently still paying into them, you're really just developing a minefield for the future. So I will be moving amendments at the latter stage to make it more accessible for pensioners to get justice in this regard. But I would appeal to the Minister to step back maybe and look at how we deal with our pensions in a much more holistic and planned way, because the way you're doing it is just opening the floodgates to the type of scenario where we've had hundreds of airport workers recently attending meetings in hotels where they are having to put together a legal fund of thousands of euros, tens of thousands, to take a legal challenge against the state's legislation in this regard, because they do have, and I believe they have, a reasonable expectation that has been dealt with in case law in the commercial court last year, and I think the government is making a serious mistake by failing to take into account some of those rulings into the existing legislation.
Thank you.